Thank you, Ollie.
Okay, can you hear me? Am I through? Yes, okay, fine. Hi, welcome. Here's what my session's about. So that's very simple words and a really complex idea. And I'm going to take you through what may seem really an abstract journey, but I promise you it gets really, really practical conclusion. So I have three sections. The first one's on image schemas, for which I'll give you the outline in a second. Second one's on how that can influence your choice of graphic organizers. And the last part is I'm going to test you. So I'm going to test you that you really got what I've been saying. So we haven't heard the word image schemas in education until very recently. It's really confusing because psychologists tell us image schemas aren't visual and schemas aren't schemas. So let me tell you what I mean. But first of all, it's so strange, I'm going to introduce it in this particular way. In Japan, they have a saying that if you want to know about if you want to know about water, don't ask fish. Because for fish, there's no such thing as water. When your whole universe is water, then water doesn't occur. However, if you take the fish out of water, then they'll have an epiphany. So for the first time, so to speak, they'll say, wow, man, I'm in non-water. Now I realize that stuff I was in was called water. So I'm going to assert that maybe what I'm about to tell you has been the water that we've been swimming in. And it's really hard to identify. So I'm going to kind of drag you out of the fishbowl. So here we have a woman, and she has two emotional states. And I've depicted them horizontally. If I were to say, I need them to be depicted vertically, then which of the two would be above the other? How would you order that? Now, I know you've all done this. I know you've all done that. So here's my first question. It's a rhetorical question, is who taught you that? Who taught you that happy is higher than sad? For start, who taught you that emotions can be ranked spatially on a vertical axis? Let me try that again. Let's look at morality. And you know what I'm going to ask you, and you know the answer. So being a priest is of higher moral value, moral standing, status than being a robber or a thief. So from a very early age, we have these vertical axes in which we place emotions, morality. When you watch the news and you hear that the Dow Jones is up, if you're an investor, you think that's good. Because you see, when we were young, all we know, and I'm going to argue it's pretty much all we know anyway, all we know is our physical environment. So we're this body, this physical body, and we're in space. And we learn everything from our experiences. So when we saw a cup filled up with a jug with water, we learned there was logic to life. We learned that the more the cup was filled up, the more liquid it contained, the higher the level was. And so internally, with no one ever teaching us, we learned this logic by, psychologists say about 2, 2.5, sometimes 3. We learned more is up. More is up. And then later on in life, when we start dealing with abstract concepts, nearly all abstract concepts are based upon our toddler logic of physical objects. Once you really get this, you'll see there's an incredibly easy and direct way to understand the most abstract of concepts. They're based upon our toddler's logic of reality. So George Lakoff is a guy who started this off in the 80s by co-authoring a book, The Metaphors We Live By. He looked at the driest piece of academic work by physicists, and all of it was littered with metaphors, but not metaphors in the sense we studied at English literature, sort of rhetorical flourishes, but really simple, like happiness, I'm in a higher state of emotion, low value ethics. And so he says, ideas aren't floating in the air. They aren't. We talk about abstract ideas. I'm going to argue, and many disciplines are now agreeing on this, they're predominantly based on physical experiences. Now, Barbara Tversky spent some 4 or 5 decades of researching visuals amongst many professionals. She's been highly influenced by some recent work in neuroscience. And she concludes it in this particular way. See, there's cognitive scientists, they're linguists, they're neuroscientists and other disciplines who are all converging on this main idea that fundamentally, because of this experience of children, we actually regard ideas as objects, and the way we manipulate them, and by the way, that's another metaphor, we actually don't manipulate any ideas. We don't grasp them, we don't collect them, we don't sequence them, we don't do anything. Nearly all the words we have, the ideas about ideas, are all metaphors based on when we were youngsters. So listen, here's a teacher, and you may know that I was the head of a special school. I'm going to say something to you, and I'm going to ask you to consider whether what I'm about to say, I could teach the children in my special school. Now, I do it differently to how she's going to say it, but it'd be the same idea. It's not more complex. So here we go. And you can imagine if I were to say it and the children weren't able to read it, and I were to say in a very posh voice, children, I'd like you to consider the proposition that Shakespeare is central to the canon of English literature. By contrast, that somewhat irascible 60s playwright, Joe Orton, viewed by many as a peripheral figure, is indeed on the very edge, if not outside of this established collection of great writers. Could I teach that to children in a special school? Or is this too abstract, too erudite, too advanced? You know, well, let me show you all it is. One of the things we discover when we're young is that the world is full of containers. So at Christmas, my grandson came from Singapore. He's a year old and he spent nearly all his time putting objects inside containers. All different sorts of objects, all different size containers. And he himself was in a container. My daughter ensured he was always in a container. And this container was a room. And in the evening, he was in a smaller container within a bigger container, and he was put inside a cot. In fact, he himself became very sophisticated. He put, you know, those cups you play with, he put a small container inside a bigger container. And essentially, that's no different to Aristotle's notion of categorization and subcategorization. It's the same phenomenon. So when you think and read about Aristotle, I want you to consider him as an 18-month-old kid just playing with stuff. So we have a container. And the thing about a container, it has a boundary. And you're either in the container or you're out the container. And we have another metaphor, another image schema that we learned when we're young. And I mentioned it earlier on when I said Shakespeare is central. We've learned very on that something smack in the middle is more it, more quintessential, more important, more significant than anything that's not in the center. So we put Shakespeare in the middle because he's central, and that's the top spot in the middle. And anyone on the outside, as Joe Orton, is peripheral, not as important. Now, André Gide is one of my favorite French writers. He's a brilliant writer, but he can't go in there because he's not English. Great writer, but he's not English. Then again, my neighbor's English, but he's not a great writer, so he can't go in either. So it's very simple. You're in or you're out. And when you're in, you're subject to another one. Now, this is this guy, George Lakoff, I mentioned. This was his co-author. And they carried on writing. They've been writing for 30, 40 years on this now. And this is what they say here. And if we had time, I'd really love for you to come with the content of your curriculum and you point out any aspect that wasn't shaped by toddlers' notions of how the world was about objects. Anything which is truly and completely distinguished from, untethered to, disconnected to physical experiences. We only know physical experiences. And so all our concepts are built about them. And when we know what these image schemas are, you can cut through the so-called complexity of concepts, and you have an incredible advantage to both understand and explain concepts. So here are some of the metaphors we use with thinking. So it's moving. We're leading, we're following, we're taking you somewhere, let me take you along the path. It's a journey. When children are very young and we hide objects from them and then we reveal them, the very word to see is totally equivalent to, indeed means to know. Then as they develop and they get some distinctions in their language, they see that seeing isn't exactly the same as knowing. And at the same time, as we develop, as we start to use metaphorical language, we use the word seeing all the time. I see what you mean. You have an insight. All is clear. And here we have the one that I'm concentrating on, which is the predominant one. The ideas are objects. We're sending an object. We're grasping them. We're collecting them. And we also have eating. In fact, doesn't the BBC have small, the bite-sized chunks, easily digestible? So we use these metaphors all the time. How else could we, if we took all these away, you tell me how we could discuss and conceptualize about thinking. Now, in addition to a container, and see we have Lakoff and Johnson, in addition to a container, we have something called a path. So when my grandson wasn't filling up containers with objects, and he was also moving objects towards a path. And he learned early on, as soon as he could walk, when he gets out of his cot, he's standing by his cot and he wants to go somewhere. He has a goal. And the way to get to your goal is to exert energy. So we have a source, psychologists call it a source, path, goal. Oh, I'll come on to that. Sorry, I've forgotten this. Okay, so just have a look at this is just some of the language. I'm just going to flip back to container. That's just some of the language relating to containers. And I could use all the language of categories, grouping. It's all the same. So a source and a path, and you're always somewhere along there. Without the path model, there's no concept of management and appraisal, of professional development. There's no assessment in classrooms. It's completely based on the idea of a source of where you are and where you want to be, and then movement towards it. Because there isn't any movement. It's all a metaphor. So I hope I've taken you, you're now like a fish. You're out of the goldfish bowl and you go, oh man, I see what you mean. I was swimming in the water. I hope you're beginning to see that nearly all your thinking, all the concepts that you use are metaphors based on toddlers' experiences of the physical world. And so we get the corresponding language. Even romantic relationships are talking about, we're on the rocks, we're going on the right track, it's a dead end. We're using these metaphors just constantly. And so I'm afraid I need to disappoint you that hero of yours, Captain Kirk, got it completely wrong. Space is our absolute first frontier. It's our experience of and the logic of upon which we build our conceptual understanding, and your curriculum content, whatever it is built upon it. So now let's have a look at the significance of that with regard to graphic organizers. So a couple of researchers and authors, Clark and Lyons in 2004, wrote a massive 500-page book called Graphics for Learning, in which they summarize all the research on visuals. And one bit of revealing information was they found that the biggest mistake that teachers make is they choose the wrong visual. They use the wrong visual. So here, I'm going to teach you the mechanism by which you can have a logical, reasoned process by which you arrive at the right decision. And of course, in the last section, I'm going to test you, of course. Oh, so these two again. So we're back to them again. Fundamental concepts is about spatialization metaphors. So before I show you it, I want you to consider, I had to invent this story because as I used to lead courses, I used to often get teachers come up to me at the beginning of the day and say, oh, mind maps or flowcharts are my favorite graphic organizer. And I really didn't know what to say because I knew I had to be polite, and yet what they were saying was nonsense. So I couldn't say that. So I made up this story. Could you imagine me as a 16-year-old? I've just left school and I'm going to a building site. And my mother, unfortunately, is ironing my jeans, so I look a bit of a twerp anyway in freshly ironed jeans. But I turn up with a big kit bag. I open it and I want to impress the foreman who's interviewing me, and I dive in. And it's not difficult, there's only one tool there. And I go up to him rather gormlessly and say, I like chisels. Now, that's self-evidently bonkers because it doesn't make sense to have a favorite tool. What you do is you look at the nature of the task, which is determined by the nature of the content, the substance, the material, and from that, you then choose the appropriate tool. Similarly so with graphic organizers, it's just a tool. And so to have the notion of a favorite tool is just, it's as daft and as gormless as me saying I love chisels. So here's a mechanism by which you can choose, we can go from the content to the tool. So, and these tools are all based upon container path. So it's not difficult, container or model, path model. So under container, we define things. I've called it chunk because it relates to what psychologists call the whole part relationships. So there are many others, but I've grouped them together because these all fundamentally define. And when we look at two or more items, we then compare them. In fact, if truth be known, we use comparison as a mechanism by which we help define. But for the time being, I've distinguished them by showing two different groups of graphic organizers. So that's really useful before we talk about individual graphic organizers, and there are some distinctions between them. We need to know what type they are. So I've been looking at this for 40 years and I don't see much progress in schools, and it's not teachers' fault or head teachers' fault, it's that no one provides them with a very simple, consistent, and therefore predictable model in which you know what type they are. So what I've done, there are 4 types, but I've classified them under these, they are representations of these 2 image schemas: container, which defines stuff, and then the path model, which you remember was about movement. We have sequencing, and we have cause and effect. And there is a distinction, and particularly, you know, if you're going into physics, it's really subtle distinction. So we're a bit crude at the level at which we speak, but we can make a distinction between things which are merely temporally connected, as in a sequence, or things that are causally connected. Now, I don't know whether you ever come across Jeff Petty. He wrote the first evidence-based teaching book in England in nearly 20 years ago now. And he said to me, Oliver, I really like this model, but I tell you, and by the way, he taught predominantly in FE. He said, the distinction between sequence and cause and effect is too subtle, which was interesting actually, because a book that I have from America, 1989, Semantic Organizers, is designed for teachers of children with special needs. And in it, they make a distinction between sequence and cause and effect. And maybe you want to do this exercise now. If you were to draw a circle on a sheet of paper and put the word be inside it, and below it you draw another circle with the word L inside it. And I'll tell you what they mean in a minute. The task is for you to join them up with an arrow. And you can join them up either with a skinny arrow, and the skinny arrow represents temporal connection. So it means and then. So B and then L. Merely a temporal connection. Or you could join it on with a big fat arrow, which represents causal relations. So B, consequently L. Now let me tell you that B represents breakfast and L represents lunch. So would you say that lunch merely follows breakfast, or do you say that breakfast causes lunch? Obviously, it's just a sequential, it's a skinny arrow. So we can make these distinctions. And if we had time, we'd go into more detail for these. So now has come test time. Oh, I'm whipping through here. I may come back and do some in more detail. Okay, so let's be contemporary. I'm going to model the first question, and then I want you to follow with a 3-part answer. The first part is identifying which word or possibly words in the sentence trigger for you the understanding of what it's asking and consequent answers to the 2 parts. So let me show you what I mean. So the first part of the answer tells you which questions trigger what is being asked. The second part, whether the focus should be either on the container or the path. And the third part is within those 2 models, are we looking at chunking or defining, that mean the same thing, comparing, sequencing, or cause and effect. So let me put slow-mo on my mind. What exactly is the current coronavirus? To me, the word or 2 words that stand out is the word is. Is. When I read the word is, I know it's something about defining, the existence of. So, and what kind of reinforces that? So what is, to me, is obviously looking at container. I'm not looking at development, sequences, causes, consequences. I'm looking at container. And I'm only asking what it is. I'm not asking to compare it. So my answer is, first part, the trigger word is. The second part is the container model that it's pointing to. And the third part, within the container model, I'm looking at any graphic organizer. I mean, we could go on and look at which particular one, but we won't do that today, is the category of chunk. So can you now look at question number 2? How did the previous SARS virus play out? So 3-part answer, could you write it down? Which word or possibly words trigger which of the 2 models we're looking at, container or path? Then identify which of the 2 models it points to. And for the third part, which of the 2 types of graphic organizers within that model are the appropriate ones from which to choose? Okay, so for me, the words are play out. Play out is a plot, a sequence, a series of happenings, what happens. So I have, the first part is the words play out. And therefore there's movement. So it points to the path model. And it didn't particularly look for any analysis or cause, so it's a sequence. So it's play out, path, sequence. Question 3, in what ways is the current coronavirus and SARS similar? Which word or words stand out, trigger your type of thinking, help you decide whether it's a question of the container model or the path model? And when you've decided that, for the third part of your answer, which of the 2 types of graphic organizers within that model is the most appropriate? Okay, thank you. You two probably got hit on the word similar. So when you have similar, we're obviously looking at one thing and another thing, and you see the word and in the middle, and there's a balance of coronavirus on one hand, SARS on the other. So there are two items, and we're asking which ways they're similar. So the word is similar, the trigger word is similar. We're looking at defining what they are, therefore their comparative similarities and differences. So we're looking at the container model, and within that, we're looking at the compare category of graphic organizers. Again, if we had time, we would then investigate which of the particular graphic organizers we might choose. By deduction, you can work out the answer to number 4, but I'll go through it anyway with you. What impact, and I'm thinking, oh, impact. I'm thinking impact straight away. Did the SARS virus have on the global economy? So the words that stand out for me are impact and on. So again, can you see the word on is a metaphor? Because there is no on. Pretty much every preposition you hear is a metaphor. They're words describing objects and their relationships in space. There is no on. Nothing happens on the global economy. It's as if there's this platform global economy and something has an impact on it. It's physical things. So impact and on of the words, we know it's the path model because I described it as being a source, path, goal. And we get from source to the goal through force. Things happen in life through force or energy. And so we have the impact on it. So it's impact and on, path, and we look for the cause and its effect, cause and effect. Oh, so here we are. I should have played those as I went along. Now, I just want to reassure you that this isn't just Oliver making stuff up, although I have to say I did make it up. And then I thought I was wonderful and unique and I discovered something. And of course, when you start reading, you realize that, you know, nothing pretty much is new. So I'm going to show you a range of different people who've come across the same thing. I want to start off with, this was the book I mentioned earlier on. Absolutely fabulous book, probably the best book on graphic organizers I've read. And I'll tell you, I've got loads of them. It's got 20, 30, 40. And we had the term container and path. I just want to show you what they did. When I went back and read it, I realized, that must have influenced me because they categorized graphic organizers, or they, perhaps more accurately, semantic organizers. It's about meaning, organizing to create meaning. They categorized them under stasis, things that don't change, that stay the same, which to me is totally equivalent of container model. And then change, which is the path model. So the same idea. Now, I found a little book in a library once called Think and Link. This is a long time ago, and they had the same thing. And this was exactly their terms. So if you look at mine as down below, chunk, compare, sequence, cause and effect, both categorized under container and path, and you'll see Cooper's does exactly the same thing. And this is almost unknown in education. I've never heard it referenced elsewhere. This is our own Ruth Walker on Twitter. She wrote a wonderful blog on the Web of Knowledge, and she used, this was her terms. Mark Sarno is a really famous researcher in America. In fact, his book, Classroom Instruction That Works, predated Hattie, and I think is far better than Hattie's. It's a wonderful blend of theory, research, and practical tips. I couldn't find anything about comparing there. I'm sure it's in there. I can't believe he didn't have it. But using different concepts, it's the same pattern. David Harley, famous for his work, and there are some schools who still follow him in England. 4-part organizing that is the same. Our own wonderful Ted Ragg. I mean, I think there must be many teachers who don't know him now. He was a hero of all teachers. He had a wonderful book on explaining. Again, I couldn't find something on comparing. And it may be that comparing is the fundamental intellectual tools that all human beings use to learn, that it's almost the water we swim in. We can't identify it. It so permeates our thinking. Maybe that's kind of my hypothesis. And Bernie Mohan, if any of you looked at the teaching English as a second language, his use of graphic organizers to convey meaning or semantics before we can handle the grammar, uses the same so you can see the comparison. So it's nothing sort of wacky that Oliver invented, or it's a really well established amongst many disciplines over several decades, and I find it unbelievably useful. And I've known primary schools teach this to their children in one lesson, man, in one lesson. So I want you to consider the possibilities that before introducing any new material, you could say, we're going to look at X. The first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to look at it in terms of the container. Do you remember the container? And we're going to look at, define what it is. And they'll home in on it straight away. They learn this stuff very easy. So we talk a lot about metacognition and a lot about knowledge. The two come together now because you're giving them meta, that's to say, this works whatever the subject. It's meta knowledge tools with which they better understand and execute their work with knowledge. And so we come to the end. And I hope that perhaps beguiling statement at the beginning doesn't sound so weird now. And you're beginning to entertain the possibility. I'm not saying I've convinced you, but when you saw the research, then maybe I will convince you. Maybe I've got time to go into another keynote and just show you a couple of slides that I chose not to do. So I'm just going to come out for a second, and I'm going to go to I'm opening something up, and I want to what do I want to show you?
Ollie, you can just keep going for as long as you need to go on for.
Okay, I want to show you this. I don't really know Efrat first. She's wonderful. She's got a wonderful blog. She looks at cognitive science. The two aspects I want to talk about. One, and I can understand people sometimes look at cognitive science and it looks kind of robotic and rote memory learning. When you kind of draw out from it, you can see that's just the mechanics. What cognitive science looks at is how do human beings create meaning? The world just comes at us all the time. And what we do, we have to identify patterns that have consistencies so we can then start to predict the world. That's how human beings don't go mentally ill. They can start to capture the world in terms of these patterns. Anyway, she pointed out something on Twitter about an article which I actually do know about, but I want to show it to you. So you can see the same idea, spatial process and abstract ideas. And I talk, Lakoff, these two boys, Lakoff and Johnson, I mentioned. Lakoff is a cognitive linguist and Johnson is a philosopher, man, philosopher. And here's the article. It's in a Quantum magazine. And I just made that quote bigger because I made it for presentations in big halls. And before I go into detail about what the research, by the way, won a Nobel Prize, it won a Nobel Prize, I just want you to see that type of language is more formal and academic than the language that I've been using, and my stories about my grandson. Can you see it's the same stuff? The way we find out about the world and objects, our bodies being one of the objects, and the language with which we use to explain it, predominantly around spatialization metaphors that are predominantly prepositions, is the self-same mechanism by which we create and deal with, conceive of abstract ideas. So here we are, and kind of we pretty much all know about the hippocampus, but right next to it is the entorhinal cortex. And one of the things that we're able to do with neuroscience is we can really closely examine people whose brains don't work well. And so people with Alzheimer's have deteriorating brain functions. And one of the things we know about the brain functions of people with Alzheimer's is their capacity for learning significantly decreases and they get lost. So not only do they have a decreased capacity to learn, they can't remember the stuff they did know. It seems the entorhinal cortex has this kind of network that seems, you know, when you watch a TV program and you watch sports, and kind of, I often wonder how they paint all those advertising on the grass. And of course, I'm so stupid, it's a hologram, you know. Well, we kind of have holograms that we push out in front of us into the real world. And it's as if we walk on this network of place cells, and it tells us where we are. And in the mothership in our brain, it logs where we are. So, I mean, have you ever wondered, how do we remember where we are? We don't take notes. We don't necessarily say, oh, I noticed that tree is right next to that boulder. We just take it in and we create these internal cognitive maps. And that's been a subject of psychologists for decades, these cognitive maps. Well, it seems that this self-same method by which we can organize and monitor and locate objects, including ourselves in space, they can see that's what works when they're given particular intellectual tasks and abstract intellectual tasks. We organize ideas through space. So it's no surprise we use these spatial metaphors. Let me show you this. Forget the writing, you don't need to read that. Guys were shown a room, psychologists were doing a study, and by the way, don't ever believe they all lie or they omit the truth. They said, you'll be on your own, private, you're going to be shown some instruction on a screen, and that's what they were shown, that from the brake fluid reservoir, you know, and they had to prepare themselves because they'd be asked questions. Of course, they videoed them. This was before GDPR, I guess, and they found that 70% of participants gestured, which is the embodied cognition part, as a way of making real in three-dimensional in space what this linear text was describing. And then they did another experiment where they told people it really helps to gesture, so they all gestured, and the others, they were told to sit on their hands so they couldn't gesture. And the difference in comprehension and retrieval was really significant. So that's kind of what lies behind this notion of embodied cognition. Now I want to move around and I want to show you, I hope I've got it here. I may not have it. Bear with me. No, I don't have it. I had a wonderful picture of someone who nope. For about 5 minutes, I was at a Teach First conference and I was on first, but I listened to the introductory talk. It was a really great talk, but you know sometimes how you doodle. So I had my little notebook and I thought for 5 minutes, I'm just going to capture all the metaphors that's coming out this guy's mouth. It was a great talk. And I listed something like 30 metaphors. 30 metaphors. We're on the road, we've got challenges, we've got, you know, it was all physical metaphors. And I wondered if you took them away, there's almost nothing that we can say. We're almost nothing. I'm still going to search because I'm convinced it's around here. Actually, let me just show you this again then. Let me just show you this. Okay. I will show you this. This is a story I normally show bit by bit, and I have one half with their back to the screen and one facing the screen. And those with their back to the screen don't understand a word I'm talking about. And I'm horrible. I pounce on them. I ask them to summarize it, and they failed terribly. Those looking at it find it really easy to follow. And I don't show it like this. I do it bit by bit, one bit at a time. So it doesn't overwhelm them, and they know which bit my words are referring to. But I'm showing it to you briefly because dual coding has two, and you mentioned it in the introduction. I mean, I was really hesitant to use the word dual coding, but I think I've made up a much cooler word called duomodo after the app Duolingo. So there are two stories. Alan Pivio dealt with story number one only, which is a very, very simple story. and it has some relevance to education, but not much. And for 4 decades, the words that he gave his subjects to remember, to recall, were really, really simple. I don't know, so if we're going to learn Chinese, we wanted to know the word for house. We would have a picture of the house and the word house. We would tether them together. Therefore, you get the visual sketchpad, the auditory loop. They would join together, and the learning process, otherwise encoding, become dual encoding. That's the term dual coding. And then, so according to Professor Paul Kirshner, you get a double memory trace. So that's why you double the chance of recalling it. That's it. There's nothing more to say about dual coding. And by the way, of course, it's the recipients who do dual coding. I mean, I know Adam was right in saying it, but you needn't say it. I mean, are you going to trip every teacher up who says, I'm doing retrieval practice? And you say, no, you're not. It's the children who are doing it. You're merely, So obviously, it's the recipients who are doing it. But that's dual coding story number 1. There's nothing else to say. There's no book to write. There's no seminar to lead. It's dead simple. But Pavio did do something else. And as I explained dual story number 2, you'll see how it links to everything I've said so far. He wrote in really complicated fashion, man. He's a really complicated writer. He says, when you look at visual information and verbal information, they are different in structure. So you know that verbal information is linear by definition, and visuals is non-linear. And the processing of which is significant. So Larkin and Simon were the first psychologists within Pavio's lifetime to do studies where they gave some of the subjects a really good diagram and another one a bit of text. The first ones were about physics problem. And those who were given the diagram were significantly more accurate and quicker and better recall of the content than those who were given the text. And it wasn't because they were visual learners, it's because everything was self-evident. And so we had what's called the visual argument, in which verbal information was deemed to be computationally, here's a bit of jargon for you, Saturday morning, computationally less efficient than diagrams. Computational efficiency. Now, before all this, another philosopher, Bertrand Russell, in the 1930s, keep up, 1930s, he wrote something, he says, when you look at a diagram, you can see all the parts, all the elements of the diagram, and significantly, their relationships to one another in one glance. And those relationships are self-evident. Whereas if you want to explain those relationships, and using his term, you have to use compensatingly complex syntax. So what he's saying is, you've got an idea, you can represent it accurately but simply in a diagram, or the same idea, you don't make the idea any more complex or sophisticated, you simply make its explanation unbelievably unnecessarily complicated. And so we fall in love with words and complicated grammar and syntax, and we think the complexity of the syntax represents the complexity of the concept, but that really isn't so. So story number 1 is about the verbal and the visual. A significant difference now, I want to emphasize this, and I hope it will make sense given what we've done. Story number 2 is about the visuospatial. It's the visuospatial. And the visual isn't as significant as the spatial, because graphic organizers are given, and I met someone in FE College who did this, used to create diagrams and put them in an embossing machine for his students with little or no sight, and they access the same non-linear relationship between the elements and how they connected and whether they were close and whether they were grouped. All those aspects, which studied under Gestalt psychology, is just that accessing those relationships through your touch is just that hard work, but they're accessing the same thing. So the visual is in a sense merely and secondarily the means whereby the knowledge is in the spatial arrangement. There, spatial arrangement. Boom, boom, boom. And so let me just finish off with this. And so, there you have a teacher with their schema. and it's bigger than that, you know, it's enormous, like the TARDIS, your brains. But this most valuable thing is private, it's invisible, and then teachers, as best they can, try and explain it in what Bertrand Russell called concatenation, a string of words. But those words have no form, they're formless, and they're transient, they disappear. But the difference that can happen, you still do that same stuff going on, but this time you extract and project one of it, and you'll notice as well that what I've shown is simpler than the schema. You don't want to show your students your schema because it's too complex, man. It's too complex, too big, too intricate, too interconnected with other schemas. You extract part of it as a model. And I don't think we talk about models enough in education. The purpose of a model, using Occam's razor, slicing away all the details, is to give the quintessential meaning, the quintessential relationships of the most important elements at a level that you've judged as a teacher to be consistent with your students' prior knowledge. And now, this knowledge made evident, made public, made concrete, made permanent, all right, semi-permanent, means that your students no longer have to try and remember what you said, trying to get these bits of words that are floating in the air and disappear. Do you remember ideas aren't in the air? Ideas aren't in the air, but you know, we deal with them as if in the air. You transcended the transient nature and the abstract formless aspect, and you put them together. Now I'm going to put that away, and I want to read something to you. Okay, can you just see me now? Yeah, okay. So I don't have permission for this. I got it this morning from someone who is writing a book on cognitive load theory, and I've done the same talk as I had with you, only without visuals, on a podcast. And he wrote, and I showed him about the container and path and told him how I use it for all my writing. Ideas or objects. I put one word. By the secret of post-it notes is use the smallest post-it note you can get and the fattest felt tip, so you don't write paragraphs, and then you move them around. And this is what he said. I'll ask permission later. It's just so good. I just wanted to thank you again for introducing me to your post-it note idea approach. I used it for several chapters of the cognitive load theory book in which I was struggling to bring together many disparate ideas. It's been absolutely phenomenal just how efficient it is. I just took about 40 different ideas on self-explanation and put them on cards and then sorted them into containers and then sequenced them, those containers, along a path. And it was so efficient. Putting them into containers and then onto a path literally took about 5 minutes. By the way, I'm coming up to a great phrase I'm going to use again and again. And with all the cards laid out in front of me, I really felt like I was commanding the knowledge rather than being overwhelmed. Commanding the knowledge. Wow, wonderful. I finished 10 minutes. Want to ask me a question? Shall I stop sharing? I'm going to stop sharing.
I was just engrossed with all of that. That was amazing. Thank you. Yes, we've got a few questions.
Yeah.
And if I go to the question and answer, but this is quite a long question. I haven't had time to organise it, sorry. So does Ollie suggest then, if teachers do use learning objectives in lessons on abstract ideas, that they phrase them as questions to be answered? Would phrasing it as a question make it easier for the student to understand the idea that is to be communicated through the graphic organiser? Because they probably link the graphic organiser as a metaphor to the question being asked.
Yes to all that.
Yes to all that, Ollie, thank you.
I mean, I have problems with learning objectives. I mean, being in special ed, the number of American books I've read in which they do it perfectly. And the more perfect they do it, the less I want to read it. And I'm gonna kind of make something up and have a very dull voice because it's the effect of that sort of writing. In this chapter, we will cover the following points: bullet point, bullet point, bullet point. At the end of which you'll be able to bullet point, bullet point. I just don't want to read it. I just fall asleep. Yeah. It's just awful. There has to be some sense of drama, some sense of a quest, which of course you'll know is the path. So a question is perfect. So you'll know from cognitive science that one of the best ways to study is to ask yourself something about a topic you haven't yet studied before you studied it. You know, no, that's stupid, I don't know it. Never mind, ask the questions. And then that kind of pops up all these questions. So when you start to get new information, it has somewhere to live, it feeds in, you create a link. To me, it's all about meaning making. So to give detailed learning objectives about subject that I haven't yet encountered is meaningless. Unless it connects to what I know, it has no meaning. So it's about, so the cognitive science really, and I think they've done a poor job of saying underneath all these mechanisms, it's about human beings doing meaning making.
Well, I know lots of people doing like concept mapping and stuff like that. I'm just thinking at the start of a lesson then, is it better to visually represent that previous journey that links in, or would doing it verbally be sufficient?
Well, I'm not going to give you what you should do because only you can decide.
Yeah.
But I think it's useful to consider that when you introduce something, you would support it with a growing diagram.
Okay.
But there are some dangerous bits. If you look up Google and you look up American Army Afghanistan, you'll see the world's worst ever PowerPoint slide, a diagram so complicated, so full, overwhelming, it looks like a plate of spaghetti. And just be careful that you don't present something, a diagram, to your children. You're very proud you spent ages on it, but it's meaningless. It's just far too complicated. So diagrams need to be simple and they need to be built up bit by bit. So as you speak, one of the problems with diagrams, if you speak, is the people don't know which bit of the diagram your words are referring to. So it's signal, the diagram that you're talking about, the part should be signaled to your speaking. So it's immediate. And one way to do that, and to avoid overwhelming, is to have the diagram build up bit by bit as you speak. It can be either done, pre-done on PowerPoint, or you draw it on a visualizer.
Okay. Ollie, thank you. One other question. This is to do with, so metaphors, etc. So do the linguistic patterns you refer to, so for example, eating metaphors to describe understanding, digesting, do they recur in the same way across different languages and cultures?
It's a great subject and they do differ. There was one difference that came up on Twitter. Someone asked the same question, some linguists who would know the answer and I wouldn't, was that I think in Spanish they talk about the future, not necessarily on a path, but by volume.
Okay.
Or instead of something being up, it's my point. So they may not use the same physical metaphor, but it's still a physical metaphor of a different sort. It seems to be universal. So there's no culture, there's no language which has transcended the body, embodiment, space, and infant image schemas. We're infants, we just got big bodies using long words, but we're working from infants' idea of the world. No one's transcended that. No one's up in the gods and they speak ethereally, just in pure concepts. Even the most abstract, I mean, imagine, I'm not a scientist, but you imagine an academic physics paper sounds pretty dull and, you know, theirs is littered with metaphors. They wouldn't be able to explain the concepts without metaphors.
Brilliant.
To me,
Ollie, thank you.
out of my 4 decades in education, it's the biggest insight I've had into the nature of knowledge and how human beings have constructed it. Because there's no such thing as knowledge out there. You know, this isn't Plato in the cave. We're looking at shadows and somewhere there there's real knowledge. There's nothing out there. There's only human beings who make it up. And how we make it up is based on our infant experiences.
And I've got another quote there as well, Plato in the cave. I'm loving it. Joe Modo, brilliant. One final question that's just come in, actually. Ollie, is that all right? One last question. Can you elaborate more on the idea of semantic organisers rather than knowledge/graphic organisers?
Well, we use the word graphic organiser, and I used it reluctantly because I know that David Harley presents a very valid argument that graphic organisers, particularly in America, tend to be worksheets, boxes all filled up by the teacher, and the kids just dully just fill in the boxes, don't understand anything, not creating anything. But it was a term that was best used, so I used it. Semantic organiser is just another word for graphic organiser or visual tool, regular pattern, so you'd have a concept map, a flow chart. But the emphasis is So the graphics is merely the means whereby the word semantic organizer makes you realize that you're meaning making. Semantics is meaning making, and you're doing it by organizing the elements within it. But it's not a term. If I started using it, people would be, I mean, there are loads of terms. For example, I think we should stop the word knowledge organizer, but it's too late, because for lists is really, if you look at Frederick Reeve's book on applying cognitive science to education, then the list is the lowest form of organization. Yet we call it a knowledge organizer. It ought to be knowledge lists. But nevertheless, I've got a couple of primary schools in Plymouth where they call them knowledge schemas. So graphic organizers, they've continued. There's knowledge organizers, which are good, by the way. They're like the ingredients. Simple. You can read ingredients. It doesn't make you a chef. What makes you a chef is putting them together and relating them into the recipe. So we've had knowledge organizers, and then they call the diagrams knowledge schemas, which is good. So then explain it to the parents. Your children have got schemas. Teachers have got schemas. And they're communicating it to the students. Let's make it visible in between. So it's all about schemas.
Brilliant. Thank you. I don't want to stop you. I could just listen to this all day. Thank you for that. A big thank you from the Bread Police team as well for taking time to talk to us all today. So many thanks for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I absolutely loved that. Yeah, amazing.
Go searching for metaphors now.
Yeah.